Okay, I think I'll get us going. So thank you very much everybody for coming today to this Emerging Voices Network report launch event. Um, so the Emerging Voices Network, for those of you who might not know, or EVN, as we tend to refer to it, is a digital global network of high potential early career researchers on nuclear weapons and nuclear policy issues. We currently have over 250 members spread across the world, and today we're proud to launch our upcoming report, Deciloing Existential Threats III, Future Pathways to a World Beyond Nuclear Deterrence. This is the third EVN policy cycle of our Deciloing series, which has been generously funded by Ploughshares. Utilising Foresight methodologies, this project brought together 22 of our EVN members to envisage multiple pathways to a world beyond nuclear deterrence. The report itself will be available very soon, and as with the graphics designer, we will share it on all of our socials and our website, and directly with our EVN members once it is ready. So to kick off this launch event, we thought it'd be fitting to invite Dr. John Carl Baker from Ploughshares to deliver the keynote speech. So Dr. John Carl Baker is the Director of Programs at Ploughshares. He helps develop their grant making strategy, oversees North Korea and China related grants, and manages the Bold Futures portfolio. So he also holds a PhD in cultural studies from George Mason University and a master's in American studies from the University of South Florida. His writing has been published by the United States Institute of Peace, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, NK News, and other outlets. He is also based in DC. So I will now hand over to Dr. John Carl Baker. Thank you very much for agreeing to do the keynote speech, and I'm looking forward to your remarks.
Well, thanks a lot. It's really a pleasure to be with everyone today. I think the probably the best part about working in philanthropy is getting to see grants come to fruition. So I really want to thank Declan for inviting me to speak. He was part of the inaugural cohort of Ploughshare's Nuclear Futures Fellows. So it's great to see this kind of interplay between our organizations. I should say, though, that these links aren't new. I looked it up, and it turns out that Ploughshares and Basic have had a relationship that goes back to the misty antiquity of 1988. So it's fantastic to see that this relationship persists and that it's taking on some new permutations. That was an excellent introduction from Declan, but just to say a little bit about myself, I am John Carl Baker. I'm Director of Programs at Ploughshares. I am actually an academic by training. I come from the field of cultural studies, but I've been working at Ploughshares now for about 9 years. I started off as a fellow, and I later joined the staff permanently. And if you don't know much about Ploughshares, we are the largest funder singularly devoted to reducing nuclear threats. We were founded by a philanthropist named Sally Lilienthal in the 1980s, which was, of course, the early 1980s, a time of real nuclear tensions. And we've been around now for more than 40 years. And each year we give out millions in grants to organizations and individuals who are working to reduce and ultimately eliminate the threat posed by nuclear weapons. And unlike some foundations in the space, we're not actually a private foundation. We're what's called a public foundation, which doesn't mean that we take public money or taxpayer dollars. It means that we have to raise all of the money that we spend. So every year, our development team raises money from a network of donors. Some of them are just individuals who give money to Ploughshares, but some of them are also other foundations like us, institutional donors that give us money. And I wanted to give a shout out to our fundraising team because they have a far more difficult job than mine, which entails giving away all of the funds that they worked very hard to raise. So as I said, our relationship with Basic goes back a long way, but I did want to say that we've been supporting the Emerging Voices Network specifically since 2022, which is when we held a request for proposals, which had a couple different goals, but one of them was that we really wanted to try to diversify the perspectives in the nuclear field. And that term field is very important at Ploughshares. Since our president, Dr. M. Belcher, became president a few years ago, we have emphasized throughout the organization in grant making, in communications, in other programmatic work, the notion of field building. And I think there's probably some confusion about exactly what this means or why we're doing it. So why field building? Well, I think it's fair to say that the nuclear threat reduction field, which we're all a part of, is in crisis. And it's unfortunate that it's in crisis because I think this is the very moment when we ought to be increasing in relevance because nuclear risks, as we know, are rising. But right now, a lot of organizations in our field, they face declining funding, which is a situation to which even we haven't been immune. And when you have declining funding, you tend to have competition between organizations over the shrinking resources instead of what we think we need, which is greater collaboration toward a set of shared goals. We're also at a point of generational handoff in the field. And I think one of the things that threatens a successful transition into the next phase is that historically our field has not always valued perspectives that were new, that were marginalized, or that were more international. And I think the risk we run, right, is that without renewal and modernization, in part from these new voices, our field risks further decline. So our goal is to halt the process and the possibility of decline and set our field up for future success. So to address the new and growing risks that we all face, we want to make the nuclear threat reduction field a revitalized, inclusive, and effective community capable of preventing policy regression and pressing for positive change. And I would say our grant to the Emerging Voices Network helps build the field in a number of ways. For one thing, it helps maintain and solidify the involvement of relatively junior experts and advocates inside the field. But I think it's important to note that these aren't just new representatives of the same old thinking. They represent fresh perspectives from numerous countries, disciplines, and backgrounds. And one of the things that I think the network does well is it knits them together into kind of something that is shared, while also expanding their skills in key areas like strategic foresight. And I would add too that there seems to be a critical component here, which is learning by doing. EVN provides a platform for these emerging experts to apply their skills and perspectives to the nuclear challenges of today and tomorrow. And while some of these challenges are relatively straightforward, others, which are no less important, are extremely complex, which has led some researchers to just sidestep the issue and sometimes even just give up entirely. I would place the challenge of conceiving, promoting, and transitioning to an international security architecture not based on nuclear deterrence firmly in that category. Is it difficult? Yes. Is it utopian? Probably. But is it necessary? Absolutely. And I'm going to quote here a line from the declaration that was released this month by Nobel laureates and nuclear experts who just met at the University of Chicago. And they say in their declaration, quote, "We do not deny that the fear of nuclear war has played a role in preserving some stability among nations. But a global security structure forever dependent on fear is ultimately a reckless gamble." Now, we should recognize that deterrence has its merits, and we would be very poor critics if we did not acknowledge and grapple with the sometimes quite valid points made by its many defenders. But as the Nobel laureates go on to note, quote, "Time and the law of probability are not on our side." The idea that deterrence can keep nuclear war at bay permanently is simply unrealistic. And I would venture to say that one of the weaknesses of a security system based on nuclear deterrence is the lack of consideration for what happens to that system if deterrence fails, even once. This is not to say that a single strike or a quote unquote small nuclear exchange will necessarily lead to a global conflagration, but rather that the accepted validity of the theory and the security system reliant upon it may not withstand the challenge of actual use. If deterrence fails, I find it hard to believe that its quote unquote restoration will be viewed with anything but suspicion and doubt. In the wake of use, in other words, there's going to be a desire for alternatives. And this is, of course, true even before use, particularly in moments like our own, when the geopolitical environment is deeply unsettled and nuclear risks seem to be rising. And that is one reason among many why collective study on difficult topics like the one that's going to be discussed today is so essential. So I want to commend the Emerging Voices Network for taking up this challenge and charting out the pathways to a more secure and a more just system. As the old slogan goes, one that I heard when I was much younger, but you still hear today, another world is possible. But, and this is the less fun part, it is our responsibility to build it. Today, I feel confident that the next generation, in beginning that process, is also ushering our field into a dynamic new form. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for those excellent remarks, and I think some really important messages to keep in mind going forwards as we continue to try and work under the current field that we find ourselves in. So I will now quickly move on to give a quick bit of background onto exactly what we did this year for the policy cycle before handing over to some of the focus group participants from the Emerging Voices Network who participated in the project. So in January 2025, we launched our third phase of our policy cycle series on desiloing the existential field, which, as John mentioned before, has been supported by Plowshare. So that's been running these since 2022. In the previous two phases, we focused on desiloing the nuclear field by highlighting marginalized subject matters. And then the second phase was focusing on the connections between nuclear weapons and other existential threats. This year, we wanted to think ahead when doing our third phase, utilizing Foresight methodologies to imagine pathways to a more peaceful and stable future. So this policy cycle uses Foresight methodologies with our EVN members to imagine multiple future pathways to a world beyond nuclear deterrence. We then, after developing these pathways, use them to develop policy recommendations to help the nuclear field work towards a desirable future whilst mitigating the risks that could also lead to undesirable futures. So the EVN program organized a workshop-based policy cycle for EVN members to develop their understanding of these issues and use this to inform policy recommendations for states, non-governmental organizations, and civil society. This policy cycle envisions various potential roadmaps to a world beyond nuclear deterrence, aiming to understand the many ways this could be achieved and to encourage a more favorable potential pathway for the future. So the first workshop that they did, the series reflected on the previous two cycles of the desiloing series, and then we moved on to our first exercise where the focus groups were tasked with answering the question, what do you believe will be the primary drivers that could lead to a world beyond nuclear deterrence? So to answer this question, we focused, the groups used a Foresight tool called Futures Wheels. And these wheels were designed to enable the groups to explore the immediate and second order consequences of change and to visualize it. So in the first wheel that we did, we thought chronologically about the consequences of moving towards a world beyond nuclear deterrence. And then we did a second version of the Futures Wheel exercise where we used a different version of the tool to think about drivers and consequences across multiple security domains. So this included on an individual level, a national, regional, global, and planetary. So by the end of the workshop, each focus group had a range of drivers which could be used to kick off their scenarios in the following workshops. The second workshop, the drivers identified in the previous workshop were used to inspire and begin their visions of the future, utilizing the scenario development Foresight tool. So futures wheels are often paired with scenario development to inform the scenarios, and the participants were tasked with thinking about the impacts of their chosen drivers and how these drivers may interact with each other as their scenarios unfold. They also identified the critical uncertainties and the role that they could play in shaping the favorable and unfavorable future pathways that they were simultaneously imagining to a world beyond nuclear deterrence. Here, they began to turn their initial ideas into a deeper exploration of a sequence or a combination of events that could take place in the future in the medium to long term. The third workshop then moved forwards with this by incorporating another Foresight tool called visioning. So visioning is often utilized by policymakers and businesses to develop a preferred or desirable future by focusing on a common set of aims and objectives. So a positive vision encourages stakeholders to achieve their shared goals and delves into specific details to help them create a detailed image of the future. The focus groups were tasked with applying this methodology to further envision their favorable and unfavorable scenarios for a world beyond nuclear deterrence. They were also tasked with identifying the points of convergence between their unfavorable and favorable scenarios. So this was helping to find the key points of divergence to help strengthen their policy recommendations in directing us down favorable future pathways. and avoiding the unfavorable pathways. So when utilizing visioning and foresight methodologies, you are tasked with thinking ahead and simultaneously planning backwards to get to or avoid the imagined future. So this is known as presencing. The fourth workshop then took these scenarios and started using the methodology called road mapping. So road mapping is a framework and approach that integrates multiple perspectives relevant to a policy or project, including what needs to be done, why it is needed, which is a pull factor, and how this is to be achieved, which is a push factor. And then it's all mapped against time to answer kind of when these events happen, often in a visual, easy to communicate format. So the focus groups were tasked with visualizing the pathways to their favorable and unfavorable scenarios. So this would help them to identify the key actions required to move towards these scenarios, and crucially to think when these steps should be taken chronologically. For both scenarios, they were told to think as if they were deliberately aiming to make them a reality, even the unfavorable scenario. So the resulting pathways could then help them decide which steps needed to be taken early and which steps perhaps could be left after. So which to prioritize and which steps perhaps needed other steps to happen before they could be taken. And then this helped them finalize their scenarios in preparation for developing their policy recommendations. And then in the fifth and final workshop, and in the last month that they were working together, they used their scenarios to bring it all together and to develop their policy recommendations and submit notes to us, which contributed to the final report. They provided guidance on how to create clear, concise recommendations that policymakers and key stakeholders could understand and realistically implement. So now I am happy to hand over to some of the EVN members who contributed to this policy cycle. If you have any questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A function in this webinar and type them in, and we will answer them in the following Q&A session after all of the speakers have gone. So from Working Group 1, I'm delighted to introduce Ellen Bergner. So Ellen is a research assistant with the Open Nuclear Network in Vienna, Austria, where she focuses primarily on political analysis of the Korean Peninsula and on developing research on the non-traditional nuclear risk nexus in the Indo-Pacific. So I'm now going to hand over to Ellen if you would like to take the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Declan. I am going to try to share my slides straight away. Let's see. Can you all see this?
I guess.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Also happy to announce that I am in fact a research coordinator for Open Nuclear Network these days, having recently been promoted. Super excited to be here today to present the work of Focus Group 1. So in addition to me, this group also consisted of Camila Alderete Alvarez, Daihan Cheng, Farah Jasmine Dingle, Emily Ford, Philip Fisher, and Vandila Shesi. And we have been trying to reimagine security, fostering a human-centered, diverse, and stable security paradigm. So I'm putting one of my favorite quotes up here because I think it summarizes fairly well what we have been talking about in this group. We are not doomed to an endless cycle of threat and response. We can choose another path. This is by Carol Cohn, and she was also much discussed in our group, I think. This quote reminds us that the dominant security paradigm is not inevitable, and that through collective action, critical reflection, and normative change, we have the power to imagine and build a different future. And this has been the focus throughout much of the work that we've done for this cycle. So how have we envisioned the current state of the world in which we live in at the moment? Basically, the problem with the current security paradigm. Well, we see that in the minds of many state leaders still, security is often equated with nuclear deterrence, military capability, basically reducing it to a zero-sum contest of perpetual competition, and that in times of tension between adversaries, states will respond in line with the thinking by focusing on strengthening military capabilities, arm racing, and this results in a world in which deterrence through the threat of annihilation is portrayed as the ultimate grantor of international stability. And most importantly, perhaps, this is prioritized over the concepts of for example, human and ecological security. And so a part of the work that we wanted to do here is to focus on creating a new paradigm that centralizes also the concepts of human and ecological security. So as to how this current paradigm sustains itself, well, nuclear deterrence is not just as a military strategy seen here, but also as a cultural paradigm in international security. And we argue that education, political campaigns, propaganda have constructed possessing nuclear weapons not just as legitimate, but also as necessary for great powers to prevent war. We often hear things as nuclear weapons being the cornerstone of security and the rational choice. And similarly, we often hear this used to portray disarmament proponents as unrealistic or irrational. At the same time, military-industrial complex is more powerful than ever, and it keeps growing and also diverting funds from other things that could be placed on more human security-related aspects. So we looked at two different scenarios from now until 2045, as Declan stated, trying to make sense of the steps that could lead to the outcomes presented here. I think the imagery speaks to itself, so maybe it doesn't need much of an explanation of the different end results. Let's have a look at the first path, which is the path to disarmament. I won't have too much time to go into detail, but basically what we saw here was that growing public support and increased TPNW sessions by 2030 ignite coordinated disarmament efforts among non-nuclear weapon states, so particularly across the global south, a global majority, placing mounting pressure on nuclear weapon states. And this activism, paired with educational campaigns on the full life cycle harms of nuclear weapons, catalyzes multi-level dialogue and gradual transparency. And so by 2035, universal TPNW ratification pushes disarmament onto the UN Security Council agenda, and states begin collaborating with civil society on verification and practical disarmament steps. And between 2035 and 2040, credible dismantlement pathways and compliance mechanisms emerge. And these are backed by an unstoppable global movement. By 2045, more or less all nuclear weapons are disarmed with robust verification in place, and the world transitions to a new human-centered security paradigm, no longer reliant on deterrence. Now, on the unfavorable scenario, public interest in disarmament wanes between 2025 and 2030 amid rising geopolitical tensions, eroding arms control frameworks, and increasing reliance on nuclear deterrence. And key treaties like the CTBT and TPNW lose momentum as trust between states deteriorates, and the military-industrial complex gain further influence over national security priorities. And so by 2035, disarmament efforts have stalled entirely. International cooperation is in decline, and more states begin contemplating nuclear acquisition, placing immense strain on the non-proliferation regime. And between 2040 and 2045, diplomatic breakdown and unchecked proliferation culminate in the renewed use of nuclear weapons, about a century after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, triggering a catastrophic global nuclear winter. And it's only in the face of this irreversible devastation that the world is forced to reckon with the existential cost of maintaining nuclear weapons. Pretty grim picture indeed. So the policy recommendations, which are obviously aimed at attempting that first positive pathway, can be categorized into 6 different themes, which can be seen here. And I think the first policy recommendation theme really centralized around this narrative shift to reimagine security in terms of collective resilience, human rights, and ecological well-being. I think in the interest of time, I mainly want to highlight one of them, which is suggesting of creating a humanitarian impact annex. This would be a template on the use of nuclear weapons testing with indicators such as victim assistance, environmental remediation metrics to be submitted by all states alongside their usual national reports at the NPT REPCOMs. And this is mainly to centralize humanitarian impacts in the biggest multilateral forums to start pushing this normative shifts. On the governance, there were suggestions to address the inequality in the UN Security Council, setting up regional nuclear risk resilience centers. This would be in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa mainly, and also to collaborate across the VMD spectrum by introducing universal VMD ban, basically a convergence of existing treaties. As for economics, we looked into making spending transparency on the military-industrial complex, basically being more transparent in terms of the cost of nuclear deterrence, but also the opportunity cost narrative, basically what does society lose by spending on military, and then what areas could it be placed on instead. Civil society campaigns as well. I think the suggestion there was to link the military-industrial complex divestment with the advancement of the SDGs. Finally, there on social culture, we're looking at educational reform. So this would be including nuclear histories, intercultural empathy in classrooms, media and arts engagement as well, storytelling through games, music, books, as well as public campaigns that aims to delegitimize deterrence culture. Also on real world consequences, a lot of this had to do with support of impact research to actually ensure that there is funding on studies on consequences of nuclear war, make this knowledge public as well, make sure that we inform civil discourse and policymaking with this knowledge, and also to bridge diplomatic divides to ensure that dialogue is being held on shared nuclear risks. And then finally, on non-nuclear weapons states diplomacy, to first of all improve coordination and strategic unity among these states. There was also a suggestion for a South-to-South disarmament forum, which would act as a platform for exchange and coordination, as well as multi-level dialogue, identify new political and economic incentives beyond nuclear reliance. So I think what this set of policy recommendations aim to do is to fundamentally reshape how the international community understands and governs nuclear weapons by shifting the security paradigm from one rooted in deterrence and power politics to one centered on human dignity, ecological well-being, and global equity. I think the next slide, which is also the headline of our chapter, kind of summarizes this as well. What we're aiming to do is fostering a human-centered, diverse, and stable security paradigm. Thank you very much for that. I look forward to any questions, and I also hope that potentially I have some of my group members here as well who might be able to support me in answering those questions as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eileen, for an excellent presentation, and congratulations on the promotion as well. So I will now move on quickly to Focus Group 2. So our representative from Focus Group 2 is Griffiths Namako. So Griffiths is currently completing an LLM in cybercrime, cybersecurity, and international law at the University for Peace, and has several years of experience in the field in international security issues such as particularly cybersecurity and non-proliferation. So Griffiths, if you'd like to take the floor, please.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much, Declan. In addition to me, I have Sana, Vera, and Emily Day as my group members. So we looked at integrating forward-looking strategies involving AI governance, cybersecurity resilience, climate adaptation, and then inclusive global policy making. So our work basically focused on many potential roles of different forms of AI in the future. We believe that as AI and other advanced technologies become more embedded in our everyday life and integrated into our complex military systems, a future where AI is incorporated into nuclear systems is very near. And the nuclear system, we are talking about systems such as the command and control structures and the risk assessment frameworks. So in coming to the conclusion of our recommendations, we asked ourselves some of these questions. So we asked ourselves how AI can be used in nuclear context, that's if any. We asked ourselves what the acceptable scenarios and boundaries can be and who gets to decide. And we know that AI in nuclear security can both be negative and positive. So we looked at a favorable scenario, and that is a 20 years span, just as the previous group. So it's from 2025 to 2045. But looking at the favorable scenarios, that's from 2025 to 2030, we believe that there will be the need for strengthening of the nuclear safeguards and non-proliferation through new AI developments. We believe that this can be done by conducting AI-based vulnerability scanning in national regulatory and safeguard frameworks. We also believe that there is the need to develop new disarmament and non-proliferation verification methods, and this will strengthen the existing treaties and agreements, such as the NPT. We also believe that these steps will also create and improve the transparency between states, which will also improve trust between these states. In creating trust, we believe that AI alone can't do the job, and so there will be the need to ensure human oversight in these AI technologies. So by 2035, we believe that relationships between states will be strengthened, especially through transparency measures, and it also improve data sharing among these states. By 2045, collaborative policies among states and diplomacy will lead to the beginning of an end of the nuclear weapons. And by that time, we believe the IEA could adopt AI into verification measures, which will support an end to the development of nuclear weapons. So in for the unfavorable scenarios, we believe that the over-reliance of AI and the lack of human oversight can increase nuclear risks. That is, states will be boldly be using AI, which might cause mistrust between these states. And this can also develop mistrust, yes, between these states. And so there will be the need to yes, there'll be a mistrust between these states. And this can lead to unsafe and AI nuclear systems, which will increase the risks of nuclear war, including cyber attacks and the risks. This will make the world unstable and, of course, the international system as a whole. So we concluded with a desirable future beyond nuclear deterrence with the following recommendations. We had 6 recommendations in all. So the first recommendation, we believe that there will be the need for human oversight in these nuclear systems. We can reference a situation like that from the Lieutenant Colonel Penrose issue in 1983, who spotted a false alarm of the US missile on the Soviet radar. He trusted his judgment. He chose not to retaliate, and we all know the result, which prevented an impending nuclear war. So there is a need for human oversight in these situations. We also believe that for a world beyond nuclear deterrence, there will be the need to establish expert group, independent group research, which would focus on emerging technologies and the risks they have on the nuclear field. And this research should be made available publicly. We also believe that there's a need for agreement on AI norms to create legislation, to share information, and also address how AI is integrated into the nuclear energy and weapon systems. For the fourth recommendation, believe that we all know what lack of trust among nations can be and how disastrous it can be to the nuclear system, and I mean the international system. So there's a need for some form of transparency among states that can include information sharing among states. And then for the fifth recommendation, believe that AI governance and arms control will help prevent disarmament. That is, treaties should be able to regulate the use of AI and promote redirection of emerging technologies towards peace and, of course, stable international security system. Then with the last recommendation, we believe that the public awareness is very important. That will emphasize inclusion regarding AI and nuclear technology. This public engagement can help exert pressure and also demand accountability from international organizations and the states involving this nuclear infrastructure to support long-term disarmament efforts. So that is it for group 2, and I'll also be available for any questions concerning this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Griffiths, for an excellent presentation and summary of Focus Group 2's policy recommendations and thinking behind their project work. So, with the second group now represented, we will now move on to Focus Group 3. And for the third focus group, we have Safchida Pachiapan, who is a recent graduate of the Master's Program in Nuclear Safeguards at Politicio. I'm going to absolutely butcher these names. I apologize in advance. But Di Milano, and holds a master's degree in international security politics from University Catholic de Lille. She specializes in nuclear politics, particularly crisis management, deterrence, international human rights, and counterterrorism. And she is also the Black Sea Women in Nuclear Network Communications Officer. So over to you, Safchida.
Thank you, Declan. Hi, everyone. I'm Safchida Pachiapan, and I will be presenting for Focus Group 3. Is everything here? Can you see it? Okay, thank you. So I'm here with Focus Group 3, representing Yusuf, Ayusha, Kuhanita, Jan, Victoria, Yuki, and myself. And we began our group work by asking what might a realistic transition beyond nuclear deterrence look like by 2045, and what exactly are the tools that we need to get there. Because when we speak about deterrence, we are not only talking about weapons, but also the systems that sustain them, such as the political mistrust, technological competition, governance vacuums, and also the exclusion of civil society from global security dialogues. And to answer this, we first need to ask why that matters. And the truth is that the absence of an effective accountability framework is in itself a risk multiplier. A world without norms around emerging technologies, without inclusive dialogue, and without transparency is more likely to experience an unintended escalation. And as we saw this during the Cold War, we are risking it again today, but in a much more fragmented, technologically complex, and climate-stressed world. And we processed with 2 possible outcomes, desirable and undesirable, similar to the other groups and the projects. And our key drivers were technological innovation, civil society engagement, climate change, a shift in global military spendings, and finally, strategic restraint frameworks. These drivers can either support collective risk reduction or accelerate fragmentation, and we will see this in our desirable and undesirable futures. So first, to look at our desirable future, which is strategic cooperation. And we imagined multilateral agreements that integrates AI into a verified, transparent system for nuclear oversight. We imagined new treaties to build trust between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states that are supported by technological tools for real-time verification. And we also imagined youth-led civil society that is not just involved, but they are essential when it comes to shaping the norms. But this doesn't just appear spontaneously, and it demands coordinated policy, inclusive dialogue, and a shift in how we define power in itself, not as domination, but as a shared security. Having said that, our undesirable futures are going to lead to escalation and mistrust that are defined by technological arms races, unregulated AI decision-making, rising mistrust and disinformation, civil society marginalization, and also militarized responses to climate stress. Here, even well-intentioned technologies can become risks. Civilian harm, such as seen in recent uses of AI in warfare, becomes much more normalized, and that leads to the public to become more desensitized, and their focus on disarmament will reduce because of that. And we need a sobering reminder that technology cannot only be a substitute for diplomacy, nor can it fix the trust gaps. It should be integrated with the humans in the loop. Our drivers, limitations, or opportunities, they tend to overlap, as you can't have all good things when it comes to one or all completely bad things. So even in both of the futures, desirable, undesirable, the core issue remains the same, which is the fragility of global governance. Technological innovation does hold promise, but only if guided by ethics, oversight, and shared norms. Civil society is gaining traction, but is often siloed from meaningful negotiations and conversations. And multilateralism is still the key, but it faces paralysis from geopolitical rivalries. So we need to take all the gaps and limitations and to turn it into opportunities. And that's why we like to say that the civil society today is driving transparency like it did not before. Smaller states are stepping into norm-building leadership, and technological standards, if co-developed and enforced, can actually stabilize the dynamics of deterrence. Our long-term vision sees strategic restraint regimes as the bridge between today's deterrence-based logic and tomorrow's cooperative security. We imagined a future that is built on AI governance frameworks, resilient verification systems, and diversity in representation. And to reach this, we say that we need to start acting now within the critical window of between 2025 and 2030. If the next 5 years is entrenched in militarized AI, collapsed treaties, and climate-induced instability, not only are we going to face a nuclear risk, but the strategic creativity is also going to diminish. And finally, here are our policy recommendations, and we group them in 4 pillars, each designed to be interdisciplinary, inclusive, and thinking about the future more than the now. The first one is international agreements and regulations, and we were suggesting a code of conduct for AI, cyber, and emerging tech in nuclear systems, as well as preparatory groups to define terminology and verification needs that needs to be continuously upgraded. The second pillar is participation, representation, transparency, and coordination. And we are specifically talking about civil and military dialogue platforms at regional levels. We're also talking about national consultations before major conferences or events, and also representation targets for marginalized voices by 2027. The third pillar is technological capabilities and limitations. We need a minimum of global standards when it comes to AI oversight and verification, as well as independent audits and principles that keeps human in the loop. And finally, the final pillar is military agendas. And we are calling for revised doctrines with no first use clauses. We are calling for resource allocation from nuclear to strategic conventional defense. And we're calling for the collaboration between NGOs, academia, and industries to foster responsible innovation. And who are we speaking to? We are speaking to 3 broad stakeholder groups. The first is states, both nuclear weapons and non-nuclear weapon states. And to reiterate from the point before, we are asking them to lead and not to dominate. The second is civil society and NGOs. We ask them to continue to pressure, to advise, and to amplify the voices. And the third group is international organizations who must continue to provide space, legitimacy, and standards. Each of these stakeholders and each one of us have a role to play, and none of us can do it alone. The final message that we have is that nuclear deterrence is not just a military doctrine, it's a political, social, and technological structure. And like any other structure, it can be redesigned. Strategic restraint is not the absence of deterrence, it is the reimagining of security through shared responsibility, inclusive governance, and ethical innovation. Thank you. That is all.
Thank you very much for another excellent presentation, Satchida, and also for everybody so far for excellent timekeeping as well. So I will now pass on to the fourth and final working group, which is being represented by Sarah Al-Said. So Sarah was a postdoctoral research associate at the Program on Science and Global Security at Princeton University from 2021 to 2024. She is now the Global Security she's now with the Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists as the 2024 to 26 Kendall Fellow in Machine Learning, Satellite, Remote Sensing and Security. She received a BSc from the German University in Cairo, Egypt, an MSc degree from Universität Ulm in Germany, and a PhD degree from Technische Universität Darmstadt in Germany, all in communications engineering, with the focus of a PhD dissertation being on statistical data processing. So I will now hand over to Sarah. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Declan. And can everyone see my slides and not in presenter view? Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm happy to present our policy paper in the report titled Denuclearizing in a Climate-Centric Global Security Context. And I am presenting on behalf of my group members, Zobeda, Fernando, Stephanie, and Riz. So I'm going to begin by laying out the two scenarios, the unfavorable and the favorable, highlight the drivers for the scenarios and some of the conceptual background that we relied upon as scaffolding for the scenarios. And then I will conclude by introducing the policy recommendations we came up with. So the scenarios. Our favorable scenario was the universalization of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And that scenario was primarily driven by new technologies and, those technologies promoting the universalization. I'll get into the details in a bit. So those drivers basically enabled radical changes that upended the practice of nuclear deterrence, which underpins the current nuclear order. So our scenario begins with the spectacular announcement from Presidents Trump and Putin that they have agreed to total nuclear disarmament. So I'm asking you here to stretch your imagination a bit and indulge me in the context of resolving the Russia-Ukraine war. The nuclear disarmament movement takes full advantage of this development. The IAEA quickly sees its mandate and capacity expanded to verify full nuclear disarmament, implementing the principles of transparency and irreversibility. The India-Pakistan crisis is resolved, and the US and Iran agree on a new nuclear deal. Now, part of this radical change is due to a re-evaluation of political possibilities that responds to the scale of the problems, realigns national interests, and centers dialogue and collaboration for peace and security. So what exactly are the drivers here for the scenario when looked at more closely? Well, this new atmosphere and the growing entanglement of nuclear weapons with new technologies renders nuclear deterrence obsolete. So I'm talking here about the entanglement of certain technologies, be it the proliferation of technological developments, really, the proliferation of commercial satellite imagery, hypersonic missiles, cruise missiles, AI, and big data analysis. So those developments render nuclear deterrence obsolete when we think of the entanglement, especially of conventional nuclear weapons with conventional weapons with nuclear weapon systems. Furthermore, the shift towards cooperation is driven by the aggravation of the climate crisis. Climate catastrophes force states to realize that their security is deeply intertwined and that they must work together now to address climate change. In the favorable scenario, by 2035, the joint efforts of non-nuclear weapon states, nuclear weapon states, civil society, and NGOs see the achievement of full universalization of the TPNW as all nuclear weapon states commit to full disarmament. By then, we believe, or we imagine, that China is convinced of the sincerity of the US and Russian commitment, and the other nuclear weapon states soon follow. And the US finally ends its stance of ambiguity towards Israel's nuclear arsenal and successfully pressures Israel to disarm. The TPNW will have a total account by then of every nuclear warhead in the world, aiding plans to disarm them, all as soon as possible. The IAEA's new verification capabilities make non-compliance with disarmament and proliferation too impractical, strengthening the irreversibility of a world without nuclear weapons. By 2040, the process of disarming all nuclear warheads is underway with IAEA oversight, but the process is not smooth, as you may imagine, as there are several disagreements and escalation risks at this point that temporarily hold back the process. There are some concerns about the potential of nuclear weapon states cheating and secretly holding small stockpiles. And these concerns and challenges are overcome. However, they mean that it takes several more years to complete full global disarmament in 2045. Okay, now moving on to the unfavorable scenario, we titled that The Double Catastrophe at the Nuclear Climate Nexus. And it is the concept of double catastrophe attributed to Seth Baum that underpins our thinking, our visualization of the scenario. So the scenario focused on military miscalculation and climate-induced nuclear accidents as drivers that could exacerbate existing risks that are associated with nuclear deterrence practices. But those two drivers, we acknowledge to operate on different timescales, but then their consequences interact in unexpected ways to culminate in a double catastrophe. So our thinking then led to two intersecting sub-scenarios. So imagine with me that China launches an invasion of Taiwan by 2030, triggering a Sino-American hot war. And the high stakes involved in this conflict lead to nuclear use through military miscalculation, shattering the norm against nuclear use and causing immense harm and destruction. Nuclear reactors catch fire in this conflict due to deliberate and accidental bombings, causing more radiation exposure. This encourages the nuclear weapon states to further expand their arsenals. Furthermore, this war launches a trade war between China and the West, causing massive economic struggles. There's also a significant nuclear power plant disaster, which contaminates the local water supply and poisons entire ecosystems. Faith in nuclear energy is shattered, weakening the NPT's pull of sharing peaceful uses of nuclear technology. A protracted Cold War ensues. Concurrently, and that's the other sub-scenario, there is a global proliferation of small modular reactors driven by the frontier artificial intelligence race. This mass spread of small modular reactors is encouraged by heavy nuclear energy campaigning from energy companies, particularly around the Conference of Parties or COP events on climate change. However, this increase in reactors greatly increases the chances of a nuclear accident. And nuclear arsenals continue to expand. So this brings us back to the first sub-scenario, and the risk of nuclear proliferation rises greatly as more states look to nuclear deterrence for security. But here we know the vulnerability of nuclear arsenals to climate change. And this is thanks to research done by researcher Kwong at the Carnegie Corporation for International Peace. So she raises the concerns that rising sea levels in particular could impact the safety and security of naval nuclear weapon systems whose facilities lie along coasts under threat of hurricanes and sea level rise, which could compromise construction, delivery, maintenance operations, and deployment. By 2040, in our unfavorable scenarios, where both developments of military miscalculation, climate-induced nuclear accident converge, we see that the Sino-American hot war, in that war, China comes out on top due to its long-term military buildup. And we see that the nuclear weapon states continue to expand their arsenals, entrenching their reliance on nuclear deterrence, and that SMRs across the world become both sources of accidents and targets of terrorism. And it becomes clear, just like in the favorable scenario, that non-nuclear weapon states have been using SMRs and SMR-based programs to hide their own nuclear weapons programs. nuclear accidents and terrorism have led to the air and oceans becoming contaminated by radionuclides, and covert weapon programs enable nuclear proliferation and a huge increase in the chances of nuclear war. And then finally, by 2045, the risk of a double catastrophe is exponentially higher than before, and this is made more likely by the failure to address climate change, which increases the rate and severity of extreme weather events, and of course, due to mass horizontal and vertical proliferation of nuclear weapons and SMRs. The future is bleak. So the conceptual, a bit more about the conceptual framework here that underpins our thinking of both scenarios. There's the notion of the third nuclear age that's characterized by multipolarity entanglements between conventional and nuclear weapon systems and the impact of emerging technologies on nuclear stability. And then, of course, the notion that climate change is an existential security threat. And this basically permeates all our thinking and lends our policy paper its title. Okay, I conclude now with the policy recommendations. We have 5 buckets of recommendations, and those were structured around our targets, our addressees for the policy recommendations. So I start by our recommendations for research institutions. So for research institutions, we recommend that they reconsider the implications of nuclear risk reduction recommendations and seek to work within frameworks that do not assume the manageability of nuclear risks and sufficient control of nuclear technologies, with such approaches being understood to support the legitimization of possession of nuclear weapons and the practice of nuclear deterrence. So we encourage researchers to develop frameworks that reject this notion of manageability and advocate instead for a common security arrangement that better responds to the existential character of nuclear risk. B, to focus more research efforts on studying and documenting methods of learning to see, to build the capacity of states to react legally, politically, and socially to accidents, miscalculation, and unforeseen situations where nuclear technologies, when combined with other risk factors, namely climate change and new technologies, present a heightened risk of a catastrophic event occurring. And C, renew and expand efforts to develop the nuclear climate nexus as an area of special investigation in theory and policy. Our second set of recommendations targets states. So here, A, we recommend that states expand the mandate of the IAEA to produce a treaty-backed agency that oversees disarmament processes, including securing fissile materials, sustainable dismantlement, verification, and preventing rearmament. B, prioritizing the transparent fissile material disposal by mandating independently verified reporting, including within civil society, on the downblending of fissile materials and repurposing of nuclear devices and facilities. Industry itself could be looped in, could be encouraged to get involved to drive innovation for repurposing the materials, focusing, for example, on a recycling model for sustainability and encouraging international cooperation to this end. And C, to institutionalize climate-based security alliances rooted in urgent climate cooperation, which brings to mind maybe Atoms for Climate coalitions. And then finally, the last 3 sets, maybe I should be very brief here. So 1, targeting international organizations, A, embed disarmament benchmarks in climate finance mechanisms, and B, creating preferential climate loans matched against disarmament progress indicators as a means to encourage states to pursue security through sustainability. The 4th set targets states and international organizations, with recommendations to A, support scientific networks and civil society, and B, to fund expert networks that link climate science, disarmament, and peace building to establish joint observatories that continuously report on risks emanating from these intersecting issues. And then finally, the last set targets states, international organizations, and civil society, the recommendations being A, research and develop policies to safeguard SMRs with attention to AI, data center proliferation, and balancing energy needs of developing countries. And then B, typo there, invest in research on SMR and data center proliferation and accident risks and the development of appropriate safeguards and verification mechanisms. Sorry that I went over time, but this concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for another brilliant summary of your focus group's work over that cycle, and a very good summary of the scenarios that you envisaged as well. So I want to thank all of the focus group representatives today for speaking at this event. It is much appreciated, and I think helps to paint a picture of the work that you did throughout the scenario, and just gives you a good example of just how much expertise and creativity and imagination that there is in the Emerging Voices Network. We very much set up the focus groups with these exercises, but the exercises came down fully to everybody bringing their collective expertise and perspectives together. And at the end of every session alone, I thought when we were doing our summaries, had some quite brilliant remarks and ideas and visions for the future. And that's very much come through in the scenarios in the final report, which I really look forward to being able to share with everybody. So with the presentations concluded, the floor is now open to questions from the audience. So you can use the Q&A function if you'd like to ask a question. You can ask a general question to everybody, or you can ask specific individuals as well if you have a question for them. And I'm going to abuse my position as the chair today to start the questions off. And I'd like to first, in fact, I'm going to let our program manager, Dave Collins, start the questions actually on here as he has raised his hand. So Dave, if you'd like to go.
Well, thank you, Declan. I was going to politely wait until you were finished, but I will go now. It's a question for all of the groups. Maybe some of you feel you already addressed this in your presentations, in which case pass. But if you could point to one event or one change that is the major or primary divergence between your positive and negative scenarios, what would that be?
That's a fantastic question, Dave. Thank you very much for it. So I'll open the floor out. I won't pick on anybody individually, but please feel free to come forward and speak about answer that question based on your experience in your focus groups. So I'll open the floor up to the focus group representatives. Yes, Elin.
Start to try to answer that question. Thank you very much. It was a really good question, and I think it's something we did touch a little bit upon. And I guess the sort of sad part that we realized with it was the fact that the undesirable future in many ways appeared much more likely. And one of the reasons for that was that if we don't act on something now, it's very likely that we might see ourselves go down that path. Not necessarily all the way onto nuclear use, but definitely onto sort of an increasingly militarized society or global society, right? So then the question, if there is an event that would diverge these two paths, well, I think in any case, any kind of action at this moment that sort of shifts our way, shifts our thinking a little bit in terms of how we want our future to look is going to make a major difference. Now, if what shape this would take, even better question. I think for now, the kind of discussions that we had in our group were mainly targeted on continued push for TPNW session, also bringing in nuclear weapon states into that discussion, and trying to understand each other's perspectives there. I think maybe that would be a good starting point.
Thank you very much, Elin. I think that's really poignant answer to the question, and gives us a lot to think about. I think particularly with your feeling on the where we might be on the crossroads between these desirable and undesirable futures. And I'll now hand over to Sarah.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Aaron, for starting us off. So in our group, when we try to flesh out the similarities and differences, and now the question is about differences, One difference we focused on is differences in interpretation of the security, cooperation, as well as trust. So I guess the focus here was basically on the conceptual divergences between both scenarios. And what I mean by those conceptual differences, so contextualize now to notions of security, cooperation, and trust is starting with security, and I guess this has been highlighted exceptionally well by Ellen in her presentation on behalf of her group. Notions of security. What is security? Is security here driven by national security interests, or rather is security based in a more human centered paradigm? So that is fundamentally the most crucial conceptual divergence here between scenarios. And then the second is as it relates to the differences as they relate to how cooperation is understood and practiced as well. Who is cooperating with whom here? Nuclear, I mean, it's not just about the exclusion of non-nuclear weapon states or the discrimination, as we see from the asymmetry and the NPT, but then understanding nuclear deterrence structures beyond, just the focus on nuclear weapon states versus non-nuclear weapon states, but so-called extended deterrence structures as well, nuclear umbrellas, etc., and the role that some non-nuclear weapon states also have to play in sustaining the structures. So cooperation is the second conceptual and practical difference. And then the third one is trust. How is trust really understood? Do we talk about, trust in international relations here? Do we talk about trust between states rather like as a substitute for what we, for confidence rather in maybe assessments by states of the actions and behaviors of other states? Or are we really talking about genuine trust between states in the sense that before the backdrop of a system of international hierarchy here between states, where there's little incentive for states to cooperate and trust, do we understand here maybe trust rather than just confidence in actions that necessitates, calculation, predictive calculus, etc.? Or do we understand it rather as states, making a leap of faith, so to say, for lack of a better analogy, to avoid hedging strategies in trying to come up with their actions? So hedging here becomes then an indicator for lack of trust between states. That's it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for a very deep and well thought answer as well. I think that there's a lot to take away from that. And there were things there that I in my concluding remarks when the report comes out, I think you'll see that there were some similarities across the groups which very much match what you said, not just in your group, but across the board. So now I'll hand over to Satchida.
Thank you. And I won't go into it a lot because I think we have a lot of overlapping points that we saw in our analysis and policy recommendations. And I was going to say the same thing in terms of trust and cooperation, which sounds such a cliche thing to say because anytime there's an issue internationally, we bring up trust, we bring up cooperation and helping each other. But the issue is, I think it's similar to when something bad happens in a public, right? The crisis is that unless you point to someone and you say, hey, you go and do this, everyone is waiting for everyone else to take the first step. And so having said that, I would say to answer to Dave specifically in terms of any events, I think there's so many conflicts that are taking place right now that is increasing distrust. And we can see that, for example, with Israel and Iran, with the US and Russia. However, I think it was Focus Group 1 who mentioned Southeast Asia with one of their policy recommendation. And I think in the last 2 weeks, Malaysia and France signed quite a big deal when it comes to clean energy solution. And France is going to help Malaysia out with nuclear energy, possibly, because that region doesn't have much, if nothing at all. So I think in some ways it looks like we're going towards an undesirable future, and unfortunately, in a smaller way, it seems as if we're going to a desirable one. So we need to keep focusing on the desirable as well, because if not, it's going to be one-sided.
Thank you very much, Tafchida. And I will now pass over to Griffiths to speak about your perspective on that question.
Okay, so I'm looking at the points of divergence between these unfavorable and favorable future. I would want to talk about, I think it lies in the effectiveness of the arms control and how we can reduce and the risk reduction mechanisms. So for the favorable future for our group, for instance, we talk about the strengthening of cooperation among states. I believe that for robust international cooperation, it will lead to strengthened arms control treaties, successful non-proliferation efforts, and of course, effective communication channels. Without this, this can lead to miscalculation and reduction in transparency, which can increase global insecurity. That is for the unfavorable future. So I believe that the point of divergence lies in the risk reduction mechanisms, which can be actually amplified with the strengthened international cooperation.
Thank you very much, Griffiths, and to everybody again for those answers and for the question, Dave. I think it was a very good way to start the discussion. So we do have a question that is in the Q&A bar. It's been specifically asked to Sarah, but I think I'll open it up to the floor as well, as it's I think a question. I think it's also a an interesting question for the focus of this policy cycle. So Adnan Bakari has said in the chat in the Q&A function, it's a good idea to think beyond nuclear deterrence, but I'm afraid the speaker's can only give one alternative, that is conventional deterrence, and the rest of the policy recommendations he believes didn't take into consideration the state's genuine security consideration. So his question is how to convince the nuclear weapon states and their allies to sign and ratify the TPNW amid the evolving security contestations globally, regionally and globally. And I think obviously that's a important question based on the current events in global international politics and instability. I think particularly the question on how do we change states' thinking about the TPNW and the current circumstances, I think is important. So I'd see Sarah's answered the question in the chat. If you want to also speak about your answers, Sarah, you're also free to. And if anybody else wants to speak about that question as well, the floor is open to you.
Yeah, I mean, I start by thanking Said very much for the question, and I am eager to listen to others, but just to highlight the main points in my answer, it's basically, of course, and the time is not right to discuss disarmament, especially in the context of getting the nuclear weapon states and their allies like US extended nuclear deterrence allies and partners to sign on to the treaty. But then the approach that we took in thinking about our scenarios and thinking through our policy recommendations was basically to expand the problem to include other existential threats to security, and via that route convince states that their security concerns should not be thought through the narrow lens of only their national security interests. And what we specifically meant by other existential threats was basically the climate. And there are already efforts to think through nuclear as well as climate, but we believe that the thinking and the practices are not universalized enough, let alone culturally. socialized among civil society and publics around the world. So we believe that we should be focusing the attempts there in trying to think more carefully about the intersections such that the resulting thinking could trump the thinking in narrow boxes informed only by national security interests. That's it. But yeah, curious to hear what the others think from the perspective of their reports and policy recommendations.
Thank you very much again, Sarah. I think that's a really good, really interesting answer to the question. And I think really gets at a lot of the themes I saw across the groups about thinking about collective security as a very common theme throughout the focus group's work. So does anybody else want to also speak to that question or that general topic of discussion about the TPNW? Griffiths?
Okay, so I believe that a lot of countries, especially the Indian, and then the Israel, believe that nuclear weapons is a form of national security. So if we have to let them sign these kind of treaties, there will be some form of assurance that you have to give them, like a security guarantee. What will make them feel like this is a guarantee to security? That will mean that there should be an improved diplomacy and strategic engagement to build confidence in these countries.
Thank you very much, Griffiths. So I will now hand over to Elin.
Thank you very much, Ellen, for that question. I think it's a very, very valid question to ask indeed. I think I kind of first want to start off by saying that one of the things I enjoyed the most about this process was actually being allowed to focus in detail on a desirable future as well. I think it's something fairly rare and very precious to be able to do in this field. Now, of course, that said, also, that was a large part of the focus, right? And so, of course, there's much of these sort of technical details that remains to be looked at, such as full and verifiable disarmament. How would we do that? In technical terms, we do have about 12,000 nuclear weapons in the world. I'm also aware of the fact of the economic costs of things. I think we like to talk about this as an opportunity for potential divergence of funds towards more human security focused areas. We're also aware of the fact that disarmament will cost money, right? And that's also something that we'll need to take into consideration. Now, the beautiful thing, though, is that research is being done on this topic. How to engage with nuclear weapons countries on these topics, how we can talk about security in other terms, because there are other ways to ensure security, right? And I think, as several of the speakers have said before, cooperation for security is a thing as well. Maybe just to give a tiny example, but speaking as a Swedish person from the Nordics does have the most integrated energy grid in the world. And to a certain extent, that type of cooperation and interdependence also brings with it security, right? I think I'll end it there, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elin, and yes, everybody, because I think there's some really fascinating answers to a great question. So thank you as well for that, Syed. I think it was important to bring that into the debate as well as the challenge of this type of thinking and trying to think beyond the current paradigms. So for the last question, I'm going to turn to Chiara, our new intern on the EVN program, who has asked this question in the chat. So thank you all for your amazing presentation. So specifically for Focus Group 4, could you give an example of disarmament benchmarks in climate finance mechanisms that most states would be willing to follow/implement? So I will hand over to Zara from Focus Group 4.
Thanks, Chiara. Interesting question, also very, very pertinent. So just last week, President Trump released the so-called US Artificial Intelligence Action Plan. And talk about what I'm going to say right now had already been in the making for a couple of months now. I mean, you could see suggestions to that end in, for example, Congress hearings, where members or officials from the defense establishment, from DoD, would share their views on how industry needs to be fully integrated into the military and security establishment. So here I want to mention or bring up data centers and the fact that the military establishment looks very keenly and enthusiastically at developments on the frontier AI front and the potential or the framing of those developments as happening in the context of a race among states, among West and China, who gets to win that race, and data centers here driven by essentially nuclear technology in order to meet the energy demands for computation, for those high computation demand large language models and frontier AI models more generally. So we are seeing interest and enthusiasm by the military establishment or security establishment in developments happening now on the AI front in order to justify more investment in the nuclear enterprise. And yes, this is just about investment in energy, but we all know, and especially in the United States, how there has been historically a convergence between nuclear energy generation projects and nuclear weapons manufacture projects. And this is at an institutional level, at a cultural level. Institutionally, one should only think that the Department of Energy in the US is the department that oversees actually the safety, security, reliability of the nuclear weapon stockpile. So when we talk about climate finance mechanisms and disarmament benchmarks, then we're talking about how states, but industries as well, could and should show how their efforts promote or take us back from or reverse basically trends towards the further entrenchment of these entanglements between the peaceful and non-peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Yeah, hope that made sense, but this is just one example. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was a really fascinating answer in there. A lot of detail in there. Obviously, it's great in this network to have such a variety of expertise where someone like myself, just it's safe to say that's not in my lane, but it's very interesting to hear and still incredibly relevant to this work. Just before I move to wrap this up, does anybody else have any comments they want to make on that question? I'll just give a couple of seconds in case anybody has a comment to make. Yeah, and otherwise, for the sake of time, I will wrap up the session here then. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming to this launch event and for staying with us throughout. Thank you to our focus group members who have represented the groups here today, but also the focus group members who contributed throughout in general and made it such an interesting policy cycle to work on and to help produce the final report. I'd also like to thank Dr. John Carl Baker for an excellent keynote speech and also for sticking with us throughout. It's really appreciated. And I hope that he's enjoyed the work that the EVN members have got up to. So the report will be published very soon, and we will share it on all of our socials, and we'll share it directly with our EVN members. So looking forward to sharing it all with you and for you to be able to read about the scenarios yourselves. I'm also delighted to share that next year we'll be continuing our partnership with Plowshares, and we'll be hosting an EVN policy cycle that utilises Foresight methodologies to imagine the future of the NPT treaty in time for the NPT 2026 RevCon. So we'll fully announce this cycle and applications for it later this year. If you are not a member of the EVN and would like to join, feel free to reach out to us. We now accept membership applications all year round. And you can also find our other recently published EVN reports on our website at the moment. So we have a recent nuclear harms policy cycle that has been uploaded, which has been published recently, and another report on the emerging voices on nuclear security. So both are already out and available on our website. So thank you again, everybody, for coming and for the excellent questions and presentations and answers to the questions today. I think it's been a really interesting discussion, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your days. Thank you very much.